We're now going to jump into the most important part of the entire course, which is multiprocessing a single raw and blending it back into itself. With an image like this where you've got clouds that are moving, you're going to have problems with alignment of the frames. If I take multiple shots and try and blend the different exposures, I'm going to have haloed edges. That's a very common issue with trees and anything else that's moving in your image. You can avoid that probably 99% of the time by simply choosing the right exposure. Even if you need multiple exposures, at least multi-process an image where the highlight and shadow of that critical blend area comes from a single raw file, so it's not moving across the part of the image where you're blending. That's going to cause so many headaches, and multi-processing a single raw will avoid that. The other benefit of using this multi-processing workflow is it's essentially like taking all of the luminosity masking tools in Photoshop and embedding them into your raw software. There's no way you can do the granular local control of luminosity masks in Lightroom. Even taking something, for example, temperature and tint with your white balance, you could, for example, do a gradient filter and have some local adjustment, but it's not very precise. Even when you use range masks, you're not going to get a lot of local control. So you can do a much better job blending two different versions of this image, maybe one where the sky is processed a little bit warmer and one where the ground is processed a little bit cooler, and then blend them together exactly the way you need. Or other tools, for example, go down to camera calibration. There's no local tool for this. You can't brush it, you can't use a gradient. The only way you can apply this to, say, just the sky for a great red color, but not to the foreground, is to process the same image twice and blend it together as layers in Photoshop. And that goes for all the rest of the tools in Lightroom or whatever tool you use for processing your raw files. Multi-processing is going to allow you to take each slider you have in your raw tool and apply it with much more precision. Let's first right-click to create a virtual copy which will process for the sky. Now, to bring back sky color, of course, we need to darken things down, and we have a couple ways of doing that. One is to bring down the exposure slider, and obviously that gives us full control. We can go very dark, bring back a lot of color. Things look great. If we zoom in here, there's no haloing on an edge like this. Let's undo that for a second and look at the obvious alternative, which is highlights. If we bring that all the way down, we can't go nearly as far, but also zoom in and take a look at what's happened at the edge of this cloud here. What happens is that Lightroom is looking at this cloud, even though it may be the same tonal values to begin with here, it's making a local correction and treating the cloud differently on one edge than it is the other because of this dark mountain next to it. And so we've actually introduced halos in the raw. Before we've even begun to blend, we've got some halos in the image. So the highlights slider can be a dangerous slider if you have dark clouds near a dark interface like this. So let's turn that off, and instead we'll start with the exposure slider. I'm not saying don't use highlights, but just be aware of that risk, because if you create halos on the sky of the image, when we're blending the sky and then we create halos in the sky, then we're going to be blending in halos in our image in Photoshop. That's obviously not going to be a very good thing to do. So we've brought back some of that detail. Let's now warm things up. I want to push to the point where I retain a little bit of color contrast. I like the warmth of the sun, but maybe maintaining a little bit of the blue in the open sky there, because that's creating some color contrast in the image. So maybe just warming up to around 7,000, bring up the magenta tint here to somewhere around +8. So already we've got a little nicer look to the image. The next thing I like to do usually is go all the way back down to the camera calibration, which these saturation sliders are great for bringing out color. The blue one's often a very good place to start, and as we bring that up, notice how much more color we got out of the base of the sky here. We haven't blown in the orange yet, but it has brought back a lot of color. We can bring up the reds and see that that's going to start pushing this a little too far. So let's dial this back to maybe 28 or so. And if we look at the greens, it's probably going to do the same thing. They're all hitting this pretty hard here. So I'm going to push the blues a little bit further and just leave the reds around 28. Coming back up, let's complete the rest of our color processing here. Now we already have a nice bit of color and spread here. One way you can add more distinction in the sky is adding some contrast. We could try and play with the actual contrast slider, and bringing that up is starting to make this area too white without adding a lot of definition, and these cloud tips are going to get blown out if we go too far. So undo that. Instead, take a look at what happens when you bring up dehaze. When you have soft cirrus clouds like that, you get this really nice contrast in the sky. Now I'd still want to make some color corrections to move this a little bit different, but notice how much more visible the rays are. So dehaze can do some great things for your sky. But let's zoom in and just take a look at some of the details here. We'll zoom in even a little closer. And watch what happens when we have no dehaze versus bringing dehaze all the way up. Notice that at the max here, there's a little bit of halo introduced. So at smaller values, there is going to be a subtle halo. But also watch the edge carefully. And notice that that edge is shifting by about a pixel or so when we use dehaze. So just like clarity and sharpness, dehaze will affect your edge pixels, and that can be a source of halos in your image. So I like what dehaze is doing to the image, but we're going to have to hold off for now and not use it until after we've done the blend, or else we're going to run the risk of creating halos in this particular image. So I will process with the dehaze on though, just to get a feel for what color I want in this image, but we'll turn it off before we do the blend. So next up, we could warm it a little further now that we've got more blue in the sky and push things out. That's an option, but I'm not going to change that too much. Could bring in a little more magenta, which does look pretty good. I like where that's going. But another option that I like to use a lot is the split toning. The way to use this tool is hold down the Alter Option key, then when you click on Hue, it shows you a representation of the color at full strength, and you just slide until you find the tone you like. And I think right around that 35 mark there looks really good. Now we can just bring up the saturation until we get the amount of warming that we want in the sky. So we get this really nice, beautiful glow in the sky. I think that's pretty good. We may do a few more adjustments later, but I love what's happening with the sky here. It's critical to note that the detail on the edges of these clouds are not blown out. You can see this is almost getting to that point here. If you wanted to bring back the whites a little bit, you could do something like that. But if you're going to do that, zoom back and just take a look at the macro perspective on the image. It does sort of dull other parts of the image. So I'm going to leave the whites alone, but that is one option you could play with. So at this point, I think we've got this really close. Let's go ahead and create another virtual copy. Right click, create a virtual copy, and now with this version, we can process it for the ground. So of course, we don't need the exposure. We'll turn that off. But the rest of these adjustment sliders have been inherited. Since we created a virtual copy from the virtual copy, all the sliders have started in the same place. So we've got the same toning and color processing. So we can deviate from this where we need to, but we've already started from a place of being similar. And that's a critical point of, you want to make sure that when you blend the images together, they are as similar as possible, at least in the transition areas. Now we need to bring out more detail in the foreground here. We'd already darkened by a stop, so when we blend this, if we push this up, we may need to come back and create a third copy that gets us through the transition, or we may not. If we push up the exposure further, let's just take a look at our options. If we bring our exposure up by, let's say, maybe even like 1.3 stops. Let's create a snapshot of this here. We'll just call it 1.3 exposure. And I'm going to zero it out. And instead, take a look what happens when we boost the shadows for the foreground there to roughly a similar amount of brightness. It's not exact, but kind of close enough to evaluate. And we'll just call this plus shadows. And now we can toggle between the two in our snapshot and compare the two results. So when we increase the exposure, we obviously started pushing the sky towards being blown out. And in fact, some parts of it are blown out right at the horizon, which could be a problem. Also, looking at the shadow detail here in the exposure versus the shadow version, there's just no question that the plus shadows produces a nicer looking foreground here. So I think this is the version that we want to use for our foreground. One thing to watch out though is, just like we did with the sky image, playing with the shadows can cause some haloing problems. If we zoom in here, look at the edge of the mountain here. On the sky side, we have a little bit of shadow halo blending over into the image because of this shadow adjustment is affecting the cloud. So I'm going to be a little bit careful about this. I'll leave some of this in for now, but if it shows up in the blend, we may need to turn it off for the blend, or we may need to do a little correction for an area like that. So zoom back and just figure out how much shadow adjustment we want. And we don't want to go crazy because of course we're looking at a bright sky right now. So maybe around that 63 mark. We'll tweak this in Photoshop if we need to because we'll send it over as a smart object. Lastly, you might want to play with clarity just to see what it's going to do for the image. I really don't like what it's doing here. I'm going to turn it off. But if we did need to use it, you could do it later in Photoshop, but of course don't do it now before the blend. So now that we've got two images, for one for the sky, one for the foreground, right? So this is the same raw, but we have two different versions of it. We'll send them both over to Photoshop as if they were different exposures and blend them together. So right click, choose Edit In, Open as Smart Object in Photoshop. Using a smart object is going to be very helpful because we're probably going to want to make some little refinements to get better alignment between these two, or at least have that flexibility. And certainly on this sky image, which we also need to send over, we know already that we want to use the dehaze function once we've finished the blend of the sky, because we like what it's doing to the sky, but we know it's going to cause issues right at the edge of the image.